I'm not going to speak extemporaneously. I want to say I thank Brother Applin for inviting me to speak here. And when I came in today and walked down the steps and I saw the mural on the wall and just the different effects around the room, I was telling Brother Youssef, this feels like a real black church. I mean, I saw the church lessons for the youth, and they have, you know, images of African American youth on them. I'm from the South, and a lot of Southern churches use, they order their materials from this Baptist Sunday school market in Tennessee, and you know they have white images. Hopefully the images you'll see tonight when we get to the slides will change that imagery. And just as Brother Applin mentioned, the young brothers and sisters in South Africa who are being killed, kidnapped, and murdered, I want to dedicate this presentation to Stolen Legacy, the African presence in the Greco-Roman world, to them and to all the youth who are dying from crack and from the new thing on the block called bazooka, which is 10 times as powerful as crack. I want to, first of all, start by mentioning a few great African scholars who blazed a trail in this field. I saw the sister in the audience with George G.M. James' work, Stolen Legacy. You'll see a photograph of George G.M. James in the slide presentation. But I wanted to begin by saying that throughout the history of Western civilization, the African foundations of that civilization has been distorted, erased, and ridiculed. It is through the records of our African ancestors that we can gaze clearly through the eye of Tahuti to tell the story. The Greeks call him Thoth. It was the indigenous Africans of ancient Kemet or the Nile Valley who heralded this contribution to world civilization. One of the early proponents of Africans being present in the affairs of the Greco-Roman world was, of course, Edward Wilmot Blyden. It was Blyden who was one of the most learned Africans in the African world of the 19th century. He spent a lifetime vindicating our people. He spent also his early years writing. In 1869, in the Methodist Quarterly Review, he wrote of the African contributions to world civilizations in an article titled The Negro in Ancient History. He also wrote of Africans in the Greco-Roman world in 1884 in the African Repository. And this is what he wrote. In the earliest traditions of nearly all the more civilized nations of antiquity, the name of this distant people is found. The annuals of the Egyptian priests are full of them, the nations of Inner Asia, on the Tigris Euphrates, and when the Greeks scarcely knew Italy and Sicily by name, the Ethiopians were celebrated in their verses by their poets as the most just of men and the favorites of gods. Blyden was followed in 1917 in the Journal of Negro History by a young African-American medical student, George Wells Parker, in an article titled The African Origin of Grecian Civilization. It was Parker who quoted the European scholar Arthur Evans addressing the London Hellenistic Society saying, "Whether we like it or not, classical students must consider origins. The Grecians whom we discern in the New Dawn were not the pale-skinned northerners, but essentially the dark-skinned brown-complexioned race." Parker even went on a year later in 1918 to publish a pamphlet titled Children of the Sun. It was published by the Hamitic League, and some of the people you see on the list of membership of the Hamitic League are people like J. Rogers, people like John Edward Bruce, people who walk the streets right here in New York City, in Brooklyn, and Harlem. Parker's conclusions were based upon the latest available research that Ethiopia was the mother of nations and that she had nourished Kemet and other nations in Asia. Parker went on to quote Henry Schliemann, who was the one who did a lot of archaeological work in Crete and in Troy. This is what Parker wrote, quoting and referencing Schliemann. He said, "Yet there were some who cared more for truth than racial glory, and among them was Henry Schliemann. Armed with a spade, he went to the classic lands and and brought back to light a real Troy. He viewed the tombs and palaces and treasures of Homeric kings. His message back to scholars who waited tersely for his verdict was, "It looks to me like this civilization belonged to African people." George Wells Parker then made a startling conclusion that shook the very foundations of Western civilization when he said that the epics of African people and Helen, the cause of the Trojan War, must henceforth be conceived as a beautiful brown-skinned girl. Now, you might have read different works such as the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer, but there are other works by these authors of Greece and Rome. But then we had other scholars, African scholars, such as William Leo Hansberry, the father of African American studies in the United States, a man who was ridiculed his whole academic career until in 1965, before his death, he was recognized by the University of Nigeria, where a history department was named in his honor. Hansberry, in the early teens of this century, as a student of Old Atlanta University, had read Du Bois's The Negro. And in it, he realized that the epics of the Homeric kings and gods was indeed an African story. He was relentless in his pursuits of documents on Africans in ancient civilization as well as in the Greco-Roman world. He even found works in his father's library, Eldon Hansberry, who was a professor at Alcorn State College in Mississippi. Hansberry summarized the African foundations of the Greco-Roman world when he wrote, "When classical literature was at the peak of its development, Ethiopia and the Ethiopians were favorite and familiar topics with most of the leading poets, geographers, and historians. And finally, in the twilight of the classical age, when the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome was capable of casting but a faint afterglow on the literary horizon, Stephanus of Byzantium, Olympodorus, and others sought to enliven the fading literature of a dying world by giving Ethiopia a prominent place in the historical stories and romantic tales which they endeavored to tell." Hansberry in 1953 went on to become a Fulbright scholar to Africa. He conducted research in the Cairo Museum in the years 1953 to 54. He served on archaeological field trips in Kemet, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Congo, Ghana, Nigeria, Zanzibar, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and Liberia. But still there were others. Even though he's very conservative and will not give credit to African people as being more than just slaves in the Greco-Roman world, Frank M. Snowden Jr., who wrote Blacks in Antiquity, Ethiopians in the Greco-Roman Experience, makes a superb case for Africans in the Greco-Roman world, even though he's misguided. You had others, such as J. Rogers, whom Du Bois had said, "No living man has revealed so many important facts about the Negro as Rogers." Then he went on to say of Rogers that Rogers was one of the best African historians writing in his day, even though he was not university trained. But then let me get to George G.M. James, who is an Afro-Guyanese who wrote the book Stolen Legacy, and he documented the foundations of Greek philosophy, education, and the very basis of Greek culture. James, many people talk about the contributions of George G.M. James. George G.M. James was the one that pulled the covers off the origins of Western civilization, because the very educational system of Kemet, the mystery system, was the foundations of Western civilization. You had such people as Thales, Socrates, Aristotle, Aristophanes. All these people went back to Kemet to learn from these African masters. And James was the one who penned the work Stolen Legacy. And until 1976, the book was first published in 1954 and mysteriously lost until Julian Richardson, along with Asa Hilliard, had the fortitude to seek to have the book republished. It was republished in 1976, and since then African people have been treating it as a jewel in their various libraries. But you had other people such as Ezekwe from Nigeria, who also wrote articles on the Negro in mythology as far back as the 30s. Then you had such people as Carter G. Woodson, who had written a story. But then let me get into some of the meat, such as the various Kemetic elements that appeared in Greece by way of trade, mercenary soldiers, and by those Greeks who had journeyed by Kemet to drink at the enormous educational centers, places such as Apet-i-Sut, which was known to us as Karnak. And at one time, this university had 80,000 students. Just imagine the effect of a Greek person going into this university and you see 80,000 people, mostly African people, learning medicine, the development of writing, surgery, trigonometry. But then the oldest Greek tale with Kemetic overtones appears to be that of Io, the priestess of Heru. And she is said to be the daughter of Inachus, who was the founder of the first dynasty in Argos. And because of Zeus's love for her and Heru's jealousy, she was transformed into a cow. Io becomes maddened by a glad fire and wanders by a long route from Greece to Kemet via the Bosphorus and Caucasus and Syria. While in Kemet, she is touched by the breath of Zeus and becomes impregnated. And she gives birth to a son, Epaphras. And if you know the story of Epaphras, Zeus refers to him as Black Epaphras. The main emphasis of the story of Io is her position as priestess of Heru in Argos, her transformation into a heifer or cow, her journey to Kemet and the birth there of her son, and the fact that the cult of Heru in Argos seemingly dates from Mycenaean times lends support to the theory that Io was contemporary with the 18th dynasty of Kemet, when there was direct contact between Kemet and Greece. In Kemet, the cow was held in reverence from early times. The most prominent cow goddess was Hathor, whose cult was that of great antiquity. And Sheikh Anta-Diop, the deceased Egyptologist, historian, and scientist, had said that in his article, The Origin of the Ancient Egyptians, that Hathor was an African woman. And if you're familiar with some of the work of Dr. Ben, he shows a temple carving, a photograph of Hathor as an African woman. The head, the body of a cow, the head of an African woman. Then Kemetic iconography seemed to be an exerted influence on Greek mythology. In Prometheus Bound, Io is called a horned maiden. Either the myths of Io arose under the stimulation of the cult and the iconography of Hathor, Isis, or the Greeks already conceived Heru as a cow goddess. Later, it was introduced other Kemetic tales into the story. And what you have is, and what you will see when we get to the slides, is how the Greeks would take an Egyptian or Kemetic god, transform it, Hellenize it, Greco-Romanize it, and it becomes something totally different. But then they always pay homage. Even in the cult of Isis, where the Greeks had processions down the street, you had people such as Nero participating in them, and they would have statues, walking down the streets with statues of Osiris. And then they even changed the appearance of Isis from an African woman till she becomes increasingly Europeanized. But let me go on and talk about Greece and Rome, which was continuously influenced by the native populations of Kemet. The cultivation of the olive and the use of bees to obtain honey and wax were taken to Greece by an Egyptian named Aristomenes. Even Attica was founded by a Camite named Kekrops, or Ka-Kepere-Sin-Wosret I. He also founded Athens. Kekrops, or Ka-Kepere-Sin-Wosret I, introduced marriage, law, government, and religion to Greece. Herodotus even recorded that the Kemetic priests taught the Greeks the concept of the universality of the soul. Kemetic inventions were even stolen by the Greeks, such as Archimedes, who laid claim to the endless screw and a hydraulic screw used to pump water. And I see Brother Kamau in the audience, who's doing a lot of research on hydraulic engineering in the Nile Valley. It was Democritus that learned astrology in Kemet, and later Greeks who learned the life-giving methods of agriculture in Kemet. Because Kemet continued to be the spiritual capital of the ancient world, it gave to the Greco-Roman world other gifts of culture. It was the Kemetic priests who taught that music was a form of healing. The use of the science of sound to unify opposites to create harmony of music. Now, how many of us have headaches, feeling bad, don't want to be bothered with anybody, and we put on some Coltrane, or we put on Charlie Parker, and we feel soothed? All this disease, and we put on music, and it heals us, going back to one of our ancient African lessons. According to Herodotus, most of the ancient Greek musical instruments were invented by the Egyptians of the Nile Valley. The triangular lyre, the single flute, the cymbal, the kettle drum, and the sistrum. It was Pythagoras who traveled to Kemet and brought back to Greece the science of harmonies along with the principle of musical scales. It was Abbé Rousseau who believed and stated that the Kemetic musical system was at the base of the Greek system. Now, what you see is the Greeks, they were cultural borrowers. They were cultural captives of the Kemetic way or African way of life. If you see someone that can teach you and nurture you, you'll go to them willingly. Not only did they learn medicine and art, they took on dress. Greeks dressing as Egyptians. The Kuro's hairstyle, you begin to see that that came from Kemet also. The lyre, the Greeks and Romans claim Mercury invented from the shell of a tortoise when he chanced to pick it up on the banks of the Nile. It was the native Africans of Kemet in ancient times that led the world in musical development. I remember going to one of the temple sites in Kemet this past summer and seeing the god Bes with the harp. This is 4,000 years before anything in Europe, and this is an African invention. It was clear that Greece and Rome were the cultural capitals of Kemetic culture. In religion, they remained captive for nearly 650 years. I can't imagine living that long or being around that long. But think, borrowing culture for 650 years. It was the Greeks and Romans who dressed as Kemetic priests and priestesses and borrowed Kemetic African gods. And let me quote you a section of a paper by a friend of mine and someone I think is one of the foremost African educators or African American educators in this country, Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III. And he captures the essence of the era of cultural borrowing in the Nile Valley by Greeks when he wrote and spoke at the Nile Valley Conference on the Kemetic concepts of education. And this is what he said. All over Kemet today, one can see the results of Greek and Roman conquerors' efforts to copy the culture that they supposedly conquered. They rebuilt African temples, churches, and schools and joined the African religion. They carved their own images on African temples. They showed themselves being blessed by African gods, wearing African clothes and performing African ceremonies. A visitor to Kemet today must wonder as he or she gazes on the many massive African temples that were built by the Europeans. Why did they go to such trouble? Noble Europeans even had their bodies mummified in the African way. They took home the African religion of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. It remained very popular and prominent until suppressed by the royal edicts. Even then, it was the influence of this religion at the house of Isis or in Paris where its influence later was found. For instance, Paris means the house of Isis. So if anybody tell you they from Gay Paris, you ask them, do they know what that means, the house of Isis? The Greeks took Serapis, Isis, and Osiris, or the Osiris circle, as their own. By the end of the 3rd century, the Greeks and Macedonians, remember Alexander was from Macedonia, had completely adopted the cults of Isis and Serapis, and thereby, of course, those of Anubis, Heru, and Asar. All of these deities, except Anubis, were given Hellenized forms. The cults of Isis and Serapis came to Rome via the Greek settlements in the eastern Mediterranean. In the 4th century BC, there was already an Isaic sanctuary in the Paros for the Kemetic merchants of the harbor. This cult grew from the 3rd until the 1st century BC. During this period, the Isaic cults practiced by the cosmopolitan society of Greek trade centers such as Alexandria, Delos, and Puteoli, and by mercenaries spread in the Mediterranean world along the sea trade routes. Along the coast of Greece, Macedonia, and Asia Minor, shrines to the Kemetic gods were built. By the 2nd century BC, there were Roman worshippers of Isis at Delos. And in these temples of Isis, one of the requirements that they had was that native African priests from the Nile Valley, Africans, had to be the priests in those temples, teaching them of this African religion. During the first half of the 1st century BC, Isaic shrines were built, though exotic cults were officially prescribed and the Kemetic religion was considered superstition. In 65 BC, an altar dedicated to Isis on the Capitol was destroyed by order of the Senate. The official ban was useless. Now, they got rid of one temple, and they had to build it back. 5 Isaic sanctuaries were pulled down within 17 years, and all were rebuilt. Dio Cassius even reports that Antony, to please Cleopatra, posed with her for a portrait and paintings and a commission of a statue, he representing Osiris or Dionysus, and she Selene or Isis. After a period of repression under Tiberius in AD 14 to 37, the Isaic religion settled permanently in Rome with the approval and participation of the emperors. And I want to give you a list of some of the emperors who were swept by the mood of this African religion, the spiritual teachings of this African religion. Many of them were getting happy in the temples just like we get happy in church. Caligula, the one that you saw this crazy, freakish movie on, rebuilt one of the Isaic temples in 40 AD. The cartouche of Claudius was inlaid with an image of Isis. Nero, the one with the fire stick, included Isaic festivals in the Roman calendar. Vespasian visited the Serapeum of Alexandria, commissioned and dedicated to Serapis and Isis. Titus visited that of Memphis or Haiku Ptah and officiated at the burial or installation of the Apis bull. Domitian, who owed his life to the priests of Isis, rebuilt the Isaic temple after the fire of 80 AD. And under Marcus Aurelius, a temple to the Egyptian Hermes was built in Rome. Commodus possessed zeal which surpassed all of that of his predecessors, and he could be seen with his skull shaved according to the Isaic rites, participating in the procession of Isis and knocking on the head of a priest in front of him with a statue of Anubis he was carrying to mortify the flesh. Many of you in your religious teachings hear about mortification of the flesh. Here you see it in Roman times, taking a lesson from Kemet. In the Roman Empire, worshippers of Isis resisted Christianity as late as the end of the 4th century, at which time one could still see the old procession go through Roman streets. Although Hellenized and Romanized, Isis, an African goddess, was the true patron saint of the Greco-Roman world. There were even other evidence There's epigraphical evidence in the form of coins and other means for the worship of Kemetic deities in the Hellenistic world, which is illustrative of the extensive power of the influence of Kemet. On many of the coins of Asia Minor, there were Kemetic figures. Before the time of Alexander, the horned head of Ammon, and you will see a slide of Zeus Ammon in the slide presentation, taking on and borrowing from Amun, the Kemetic god. There also appeared in Asia Minor on coins issued in the 5th and 4th century representations of Zeus, as I had mentioned, borrowing from Amun. There were other coins at Malta of the 2nd and 1st century before Christ that show the cult of Isis and its importance. There were also cults of Isis in Crete. You will see maps showing how the cult of Isis goes from Memphis and from inner Africa, northeast Africa, and the Nile Valley, up into southern Europe, Sicily, Greece, and Rome. And many of you wonder, well, where did this Black Madonna story come from? This is the story that you see in the story of Isis and Horus, or Set and Heru. Evidence of the Isaic cults are present in bas-reliefs and coins and other antiquities found in Megara, Corinth, and Argos. It is also in the area of science, mathematics, and medicine that Kemetic civilization gave impetus to the Greco-Roman world. Scientifically, the Kamites were the masters of science in the ancient world. Diop says of them, it is only when the Greeks came to Kemet, principally Archimedes, that he came back from Egypt and said he invented the endless screw after seeing it in Kemet. Then he further states that the formula C equals pi times D is attributed to Diostratus. This formula, which gives the length of the circumference of what is believed to have been established by the Egyptians as the circumference of a circle, has been alleged to have been originated by a Greek author. But it was also known that Eratosthenes was the one that coined and invented the circumference of the circle. They go on to list other persons such as Hippocrates, who we all know was not the real father of medicine, but Imhotep. It is important that the Kamites of the Nile Valley produced the world's first physicians, they produced the world's first medical knowledge and literature. It was the native Africans of Kemet who influenced the contributions of Hippocrates with the Hippocratic Oath. It was Hippocrates in his own essay on ancient medicine that reveals the invention of medicine that came from the Kamites. Even Pythagoras returned to Greece and then to Cronan, Italy, where he established a brotherhood imitating the Kemetic priesthood in dress, practice, and philosophy. The Greeks and Romans both continued to use Kemetic methods of arithmetic. Even G. Sarton believed that the ancient Greeks believed Kemet was the birthplace of astronomy. It was also in Alexandria that native Africans continued to bestow Kemetic genius on the Greeks. But then you had cases where Kemetic gods were borrowed by Greeks. Asar or Osiris, Osiris being a Greek name, of course, becomes Dionysus or Serapis Pluto to the Greeks. Or Set or Isis becomes Demeter when she becomes Greek. Heru, when he gets to Greece, changes to Apollo. Neith becomes Athena. Hathor, the African woman, becomes Aphrodite. Amun becomes Zeus. Tahuti becomes Hermes. Ptah, Hephaestus. Amun-Ra becomes Ares. Khonsu becomes Hercules. Imhotep becomes Aesculapius. Heru-Khatu becomes Hermachus. The Benu bird becomes the phoenix. Nut becomes Re. Ra becomes Helos, Seb becomes Kronos, Set becomes Typhon, and Apu becomes Panopeus. So you see, for 600 years, the Greeks, after 332 BC, and after being prohibited for 5,000 years, came and were educated by Kemetic priests in increasing numbers. They studied directly in the Kemetic mystery system, even though there were restrictions. Even Pythagoras was given a runaround when he went to Heliopolis to be educated by the Kemetic priests. They were taught by others who had direct contact with the Kemetic priests, and the Greeks, as I said, were taught fragments. They were not given the whole story. But scholars knew this. They knew the African contribution to the Greco-Roman world. They knew that the Greeks got their knowledge from ancient Kemet. But then there was the big ripoff. Up until the 19th century, the story was told that Africa gave impetus to the Greco-Roman world. Then, because of racism, the story began to be changed. You had cases where whole new histories were written. There was a place in Germany called a university called Göttingen University. And at this university, some of the major educators were educated from Germany and England. The university was founded in 1734 by George II. He was later the Elector of Hanover and the King of England. And at this university, they laid the foundation for racism, colonialism, and imperialism. Now, I'm going to give you some of the names and some of the highlights of some of these professors who shrouded many of their own people in ignorance about this story of the African contribution to Greco-Roman civilization, our stolen legacy. That was Johann Winckelmann. And Winckelmann was recognized by many as the founder of the academic discipline of his story. He worked mainly in the 1780s and 90s, and he even described Kemetic or African art as primitive. But then when he described these Africans, he said they were snub-nosed and bandy-legged. Then there was John Frederick Bulenbach, and he developed the theory of race, including the superiority of the Aryans. And he was a professor of natural history and introduced the term Caucasian into our language. Then you had Carl Muller, and he was the person who developed the system of source criticism. And this was the first step in discrediting ancient sources. All those people such as Homer, Herodotus, and telling people that these people didn't know what they were talking about, even if they saw a Kemetic person or an African person standing right before them, that they were crazy, in essence. Then you had people such as Frederick or Christoph Humann. You had Auguste Wolff, who was the librarian at Göttingen University. And he was the one that felt that Homer was the signal for the beginning of European civilization. And then there is some question as to whether Homer existed, because there were a number of different Homers. Then you had, of course, Christian Bunsen, who was an Egyptologist. You had A.H. Herin, who was a professor of history. And this person, Herin, was ostracized because he felt that the ancient model was correct, and he didn't want to agree with them regarding the African origin of Greco-Roman civilization. But the story shows that we are people that influence world culture and civilization. Europeans go back to Greece and Rome for their cultural heritage. This is our culture and this is our heritage. But what you're about to see is how they were influenced by us, that they were a mixed culture, a culture of cultural parasites. Just as you look at the Idiot Box and see them using our music for background music, for skits and so forth, just as they put King Cut's dog food on the air rather than put an African person in comedic dress, they'll put a dog up there, you know, trying to portray our culture. But let me go to the first slide, the title slide, brother. Could someone kill the lights up here on the stage? Yes, please. Okay. As you know, the presentation is the stolen legacy of the African presence in the Greco-Roman world.